let's look at the anatomy of the adrenal glands. And our adrenal glands have several layers. So, if you recall, we've got our zona glomerulosa at the top. We've got our zona fasciculata in the middle of the cortex. Then we've got our zona reticularis. And then we've got our medulla. So there's kind of a lot to talk about as far as the regulation of the hormones coming from the adrenal glands. If we first look at the zona glomerulosa, it's releasing this hormone called aldosterone, or mineralocorticoid. It's a mineralocorticoid because it's affecting mineral balance. And it's going to be activated in response to what's called the renin-angiotensin system, which gets activated during blood pressure drops. Or it will be activated in response to high potassium. And the reason is that aldosterone is going to stimulate the kidneys to uptake sodium. So the target of aldosterone are the kidneys, and what it causes them to do is uptake sodium. When you uptake sodium, when you pull sodium out of the urine, you excrete potassium into the urine. They move opposite directions. So the stimulus for release of the zona glomerulosa will either be high levels of potassium or this hormone called angiotensin II. So we're going to look at the renin-angiotensin system now that is going to be the mechanism by which we get this angiotensin II. So for angiotensin II, it's kind of this complex system. It's called RAS, R-A-S, or the renin-angiotensin system. And the stimulus for activation of the renin-angiotensin system is going to be a drop in blood pressure. So if you get a drop in blood pressure, this is sensed by the kidneys, this area called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. We'll look at that when we look at the urinary system. We'll look at this in more detail. So we are going to see this again, but we'll say this is sensed by the kidneys. And they're going to respond by releasing this hormone renin. The liver is always producing, this is my liver, it's got cirrhosis. Sorry, it's green. It's always producing this stuff called renin substrate. Or its chemical name is angiotensinogen. So when we have a drop in blood pressure and renin is released to the system, it can combine with renin substrate that is always in the blood and become what's called angiotensin II. So we get renin plus angiotensinogen is going to give us angiotensin I, I'm sorry. It gives us angiotensin I. Angiotensin I then is going to enter venous blood and go to the heart, and then the heart is going to pump it through what's called the pulmonary circuit in the lungs. So angiotensin I, we'll say, gets pumped through heart to lungs. And in the lungs contain this enzyme called angiotensin converting enzymes. So our lungs have, or it's also called ACE. And ACE is the angiotensin converting enzyme. So ACE, the angiotensin converting enzyme, converts angiotensin I to angiotensin II. So that's its job, is to convert angiotensin I to angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is a powerful hormone in raising blood pressure. So our stimulus for the whole activation of the system is a drop in blood pressure. So now angiotensin 2 is going to be able to act on effectors in the system to quickly raise blood pressure. So I'm going to erase this top part of my board so we can talk about those effectors. So we've gotten from the liver to the heart, now to the lungs with the angiotensin converting enzyme. We go from angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to be able to stimulate our effectors in the system. The first one is it's going to stimulate the zona glomerulosa to release aldosterone. Aldosterone targets the kidneys to increase sodium uptake, or increase sodium reabsorption. So with sodium goes water. So as we increase our sodium uptake, water follows. So by increasing the water, we increase our blood volume, and then we increase our blood pressure. So just by having more blood volume around, that's one way that we can increase blood pressure. Another thing that angiotensin 2 does is it stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone. So it'll stimulate our hypothalamus to release antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is also going to stimulate the kidneys to uptake water, but through a different mechanism, by increasing our aquaporins so that we can just bring in more water. So there's another mechanism by which we can increase our blood volume and therefore increase our blood pressure. So antidiuretic hormone stimulates our kidneys to uptake water. So there's a second mechanism by which we're increasing water reabsorption in the kidneys. By increasing our blood volume, we help to increase our blood pressure. Another thing that it does at the hypothalamus is it stimulates what's called dipsogenesis, or thirst. So if you get thirsty and you drink more, then you increase your blood volume and increase your blood pressure. The last thing that angiotensin 2 does is it stimulates vasoconstriction. And it's a pretty potent vasoconstrictor. So as soon as it exits the heart and hits our arteries, we can constrict those arteries. And if you narrow the diameter of a vessel that's pushing on the blood, then the pressure of the blood going through will increase. So it'll stimulate vasoconstriction. So by increasing our blood volume by these two mechanisms, well, three mechanisms, by increasing aldosterone release, increasing antidiuretic hormone release, increasing your thirst, all of those are going to bring up your blood volume. And if you decrease the diameter of the blood vessels that are squeezing on that blood, then you'll also increase the blood pressure. So we've got lots of mechanisms to increase the blood pressure and bring us back to homeostasis. So we'll talk about the renin-angiotensin system again when we get to the heart, and we'll talk about it a little bit when we get to the kidneys in the urinary system. So are there any questions on that? Mm-hmm.
So once it passes through the lungs, is that where the enzyme is at?
Yeah, that's where ACE is in the lung.
Okay.
So it's this kind of complex system that relies on many organs. And if you want to go home and redraw it, I usually draw it with all the organs in place. So we've got our lungs are involved, and your heart, and your liver. It's a horrible liver. I don't know what's wrong with my liver today. And your kidneys. So draw your organs and then figure out what each one's doing, how it's acting in the system. Any other questions on the renin-angiotensin system? So it's pretty complex, but that's how we're getting aldosterone, which is coming from our zona glomerulosa. Actually, I probably don't need to erase that because I can move to the next. So for cortisol, this is coming from the zona fasciculata. And this is what we call the HPA axis. So the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis. And it all starts up in the hypothalamus with little neurons that are releasing CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. They release corticotropin-releasing hormone into the primary plexus. It travels through our portal veins and pools in corticotropes in those blood vessels in the secondary plexus. So our cells, our corticotropes, they're going to bind CRH and CRH receptors and respond by releasing ACTH. ACTH targets the zona fasciculata and stimulates cortisol release. Again, cortisol is our glucocorticoid, and so it's going to increase our blood glucose levels. So what could we say about cortisol? It is glycogenolytic, so it'll stimulate glycogenolysis in the liver. It is protein catabolic, so it will stimulate protein breakdowns in skeletal muscle is really the biggest store of protein. Over the long haul, you'll convert to lipolytic, but it's easier to get protein, or it's easier to get glucose from protein. So also, if we're using this protein to get glucose, then we could also say it's gluconeogenic, because we'll have to make new glucose using those proteins as our non-carbohydrate substrate. And we'll say to a lesser degree, it's lipolytic. Lipolytic. But it's harder to get glucose from fats than it is from protein, so this will happen first. That's what makes cortisol levels, chronically high cortisol levels, more dangerous. Because you're breaking down good skeletal muscle that you need, when we'd rather be breaking down fat. All right, any questions on the HPA axis? As far as our zona reticularis goes, again, this is under complex regulation. I'm not really going to have you worry too much about it. ACTH can stimulate a little bit of our adrenal androgen release. They're also called our gonatocorticoids. But they're adrenal androgens, DHEA and DHEAS. And so ACTH will stimulate it a little bit. Postmenopausal women tend to get their androgens from the zona reticularis. It's most important in the developing fetus, so where we need to have androgens for sexual differentiation. As far as the adrenal medulla goes, these are called chromaffin cells that are responding to sympathetic nervous system activation and releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these two hormones are going to act basically as synergists with the sympathetic nervous system to amplify all of the effects that the sympathetic nervous system is doing. So you've got an increase in heart rate and force of contraction. You would increase respiration, increase pupil dilation, all of that. So you can review your sympathetic nervous system to see what all the targets are. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are just going to potentiate the effects of sympathetic nervous system activation. All right, questions on the adrenal glands? Stress is going to be the primary stimulus for starting our HPA axis. So you could call that a neural stimulus that gets CRH going, and then CRH is the hormonal stimulus that gets ACTH going. So chronically high stress levels will result in chronically high cortisol levels. You can tell how stressed an animal is by looking at their adrenal gland. If they've got really huge zona fasciculatas, then you know they're under a lot of stress. Okay, so for our pancreas is going to be involved in blood glucose homeostasis, and the part of the pancreas that is going to be releasing our hormones are the pancreatic islets. So our pancreatic islets have two types of cells that are going to be responding to differing levels of blood glucose. We've got alpha cells Who remembers what they release? Glucagon. And beta cells that release insulin. So when blood glucose levels are low in between meals, so if we were looking at a negative feedback loop then, we could say to activate our alpha cells, we would have a drop in blood glucose. So like between meals, you get a little hungry, you get a little lightheaded, then your alpha cells are going to detect this. So the alpha cells would be the sensor in this case. They're also the control center because they're releasing glucagon. And what glucagon is going to be able to do is raise blood glucose levels. So it's going to be able to do this by stimulating the liver. So the liver is going to be our primary target. And it will stimulate the liver to break down glycogen. So it'll stimulate glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of our stored glycogen, so our glycogen will be converted back to glucose, and that would raise our blood glucose levels. It will also stimulate gluconeogenesis, at our liver so that we can use our non-carbohydrate substrates, such as proteins or fats that may be floating around in the system, to stimulate gluconeogenesis. And that will help to raise our blood glucose levels and shut down that negative feedback loop. So our alpha cells are the sensor and the control center. And our effector, our primary effector, is going to be the liver. Now, when you eat a meal, after your meal, you're all nutrient rich, you've got a bunch of nutrients floating around, including glucose. That's when we will stimulate our beta cells. So an increase in glucose is going to stimulate our beta cells. So they're the sensor and the control center when blood glucose levels are high. And our beta cells will release insulin that is going to target many effectors. The effectors will be our liver, which will do glycogenesis. So we can take that excess glucose and convert it to glycogen. It will actually stimulate lipogenesis in adipose tissue. If we've got we've just eaten a meal, so we've got proteins floating around, then we can stimulate our muscles to increase protein anabolism. Basically what insulin is doing is causing you to store everything that you can. So insulin is a big storage hormone. And it will also stimulate all cells in our body to uptake glucose. So if you think about it, cellular respiration is the process by which we take glucose and use oxygen and convert it to ATP. So insulin will actually be able to target all cells and stimulate glucose uptake. So those cells can uptake that glucose and use it for whatever they do. In the case of our adipocytes, they make fat, so we'll increase lipogenesis. In the case of all, like our neurons, they'll uptake that glucose and send nervous signals. So nervous tissue is actually the biggest sucker of glucose, so insulin is going to help them to uptake glucose as every other cell. So that's its big job, but it's a big storage hormone. Are there any questions on that? So that's our pancreas.